The water was a silent, brutal conqueror that arrived under the cover of a raging storm. It seeped into living rooms with quiet determination, rose relentlessly in garages where families stored their memories, and transformed the meticulously manicured lawns of Oakshire Meadows into shallow, murky ponds that reflected the gray, angry sky above. In the midst of the chaos, where the frantic shouts of residents mingled with the distant wail of approaching sirens, Devin Rucker stood immobile in what had once been his backyard. His bare feet were numb to the cold. His eyes locked on the stark gray concrete wall that cut through the devastation like a tombstone. This was the Homeowners Association's grand vision of perfection, the beautification project they had sworn would enhance their community's value and appeal. Now it stood as a damning monument to their arrogance, a man-made failure that had turned 27 homes into a temporary swamp and countless lives into case studies of preventable disaster. Reporters had arrived, with their cameras even before the county emergency vehicles, their lenses capturing the tears and the ruined furniture floating in brown water, giving a voice to the drenched woman who screamed at a news crew, "We told them! We told them this would happen!" In that moment, the narrative shifted irrevocably from mere property damage to a profound lesson in negligence and the consequences of ignoring nature's warnings. Devin, his jeans soaked through and his hands clenched into trembling fists at his sides, said nothing. He simply watched the current carry away the wooden lawn chairs from the yard he had lovingly maintained for nearly a decade. He had tried to warn them, had sent the carefully worded emails, presented the printed maps from the county surveyor's office, and pleaded with logic and data. They had dismissed him, some with condescending smiles, others with outright laughter. The very people who had once affectionately called the creek a ditch were now witnessing its powerful, destructive response to being entombed. But to understand how this quiet, unassuming man became the focal point of this disaster, one had to rewind to a time of peace, before the storm clouds of conflict had even gathered on the horizon. The creek behind Devin's home was not just a geographical feature. It was the neighborhood's pulse, its steady rhythm a constant in a world of change. Its gentle trickle was the soundtrack to quiet morning coffees on the porch, the scent of wet grass after a summer rain its distinctive perfume. Devin was its self-appointed guardian, clearing debris after heavy storms and tending to its banks not for praise or payment, but out of a deep-seated respect for the natural world that he felt was increasingly disappearing from their suburban landscape. It was a living thread that connected homes, where children tossed pebbles and dreamed of pirates, and neighbors like Norma Blanchard would bring him iced tea on humid afternoons. And Eddie Granger, the retired mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, had helped him build a small footbridge that became the neighborhood's unofficial gathering spot. This delicate harmony was shattered when Margot Leary arrived with her U-Haul truck and ambitious eyes. With her perpetually pressed khakis, ever-present clipboard, and a smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes, she saw not a vibrant ecosystem, but an unsightly eyesore that offended her sense of order. As the newly elected HOA president, her campaign for bringing order to Oaks and Meadows began with politely worded letters about lawn height and approved paint colors, but it quickly zeroed in on the creek with the precision of a laser. She labeled it a breeding ground for mosquitoes and rodents, a blight on property values, and an obstacle to the uniform perfection she envisioned. At the fateful HOA meeting in her impeccably clean, almost sterile living room, Devin stood before his neighbors with county maps and hydrological data printed in color. "This isn't just a stream," he argued, his voice steady but urgent with concern. "It's a natural drainage line that handles all the runoff from Oak Street. If you block it, the water has to go somewhere else. That somewhere will be your basements, your garages, your living rooms." Margot listened with an air of detached patience before presenting her own vision. Sleek, concrete channels that promised a sterile, controlled perfection, complete with decorative rocks and neatly trimmed shrubs. "We are replacing chaos with order, Devin," she stated, her tone leaving no room for debate or sentimentality. When the vote was called, hands rose in favor of her plan, one after another, from people he had helped with fallen trees and shared barbecues with. As he gathered his unanswered maps and papers, the weight of their collective dismissal settled upon his shoulders like a physical burden. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low but clear in the quiet room. "And when it rains, you'll all remember this moment." Her reply was a soft, cutting whisper that would haunt him through the coming months. "Let's hope you're wrong, Devin." The rumble of diesel engines at dawn on a Saturday morning was the sound of inevitability made manifest. The trucks rolled in, carrying the very tools that would seal the creek's fate: cement mixers, rebar, and piles of wooden forms. Devin, armed only with his phone camera and a profound sense of dread, documented the invasion. "This is unauthorized work on a protected drainage path," he told the foreman, who merely shrugged, citing signed approval from the HOA board. When Margot appeared, pristine in white slacks and a triumphant expression, the confrontation was brief and bitter. "You're not managing the water, you're blocking it," Devin insisted, his frustration finally boiling over. "Water doesn't just vanish when you pour cement on it, Margot. It will back up, it will find another path, and it will be through our homes." Margot's jaw tightened visibly, her polished composure cracking for just a fraction of a second. "Mr. Rucker, please step aside and let the professionals do their work." He didn't move, but it made no difference. The order was given, and the machinery sprang to life with roaring indifference. By noon, the air was thick with the sharp metallic smell of wet cement. Devin watched, a knot of cold despair tightening in his stomach, as the gray slurry smothered the vibrant creek, silencing its gentle flow forever and filling the space with an unnatural flat surface. The visual was jarring. Where there was once life, movement, and sound, there was now a sterile, concrete scar running through the heart of the community. That evening, the silence on his porch was heavier than any he had ever known. Norma and Eddie sat with him, all three staring at the grim gray channel that seemed to absorb the evening light rather than reflect it. "Looks clean, I'll give her that," Eddie conceded, his voice hollow with disappointment. "But man, that don't look right. It just doesn't feel right." Devin's response was a grim prophecy spoken to the gathering dusk. "It's not. You block water, it finds another path. It always does. Physics doesn't care about HOA votes." In the weeks that followed, a superficial normalcy returned to Oakshire Meadows. Margot hosted a lavish ribbon-cutting ceremony for her Oaks Creek Renewal project, celebrating with balloons, a catered spread, and forced smiles for photographs. But Devin noticed the warning signs that others willfully ignored: persistent yellow puddles at the edges of the concrete that refused to drain even days after a light shower, a cloying smell of dampness and mildew that hung in the air near the lower yards, the once lush grass at the concrete's edges now turning a sickly, defeated yellow. He continued his one-man campaign of documentation, sending time-stamped footage and increasingly desperate pleas to the county's environmental office, only to receive polite automated replies promising a review. The tension was a palpable force in the humid summer air, thickening with each passing day until it became unbearable. Then the storm came, announced by a distant rumble that grew into a deafening roar. It began as a steady drumbeat on rooftops, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour that seemed to have no end. Devin was at his window, his worst fears materializing in the ominously rising water in his own backyard. He grabbed his phone, his narration calm but grim with validation. "September 14th, 8:47 p.m. The concrete channel is at capacity. The storm drains are backing up onto the streets. In approximately 20 minutes, it will overflow into the first yards." He was a prophet watching his prophecy unfold in real time, with no satisfaction, only a profound sorrow. The neighborhood quickly descended into panicked chaos. Eddie's garage was flooding, his precious tools floating away in the murky water. Norma struggled against the current, her umbrella ripped inside out by the wind. And then came the defining sound that cut through the storm's fury, a deep, groaning crack, like the earth itself breaking its bonds, as the concrete channel, unable to contain the pent-up fury of the water any longer, split apart. The creek was violently reclaiming its ancestral path, carving through the man-made obstruction with terrifying power. Through the sheets of rain, Devin saw Margot on her porch, her designer raincoat soaked through and clinging to her frame. her face a mask of stunned, horrified disbelief as her perfectly arranged backyard, with its decorative lights and symmetrical shrubs, vanished beneath the churning brown water. He waded through waist-deep, chilling water to help his neighbors, his camera capturing the devastating proof they would need later. As rescue boats finally arrived and shell-shocked families were evacuated, he stood firm, a solitary, resolute figure documenting the catastrophic consequences of human arrogance. Turning his lens one last time to the broken, useless concrete, he spoke into the howling wind, his voice a stark, simple verdict against the folly he had witnessed. This is what happens when people think they can control nature. You can't bury a creek. You can only bury your common sense. In the waterlogged aftermath, a heavy, exhausted silence fell over Oakshire Meadows, broken only by the squelch of mud underfoot and the grim sounds of ruined belongings being dragged to the curb. The floodwaters had receded, but they had left behind a landscape of profound loss and a thick, pervasive smell of mildew that promised to linger for months. Devon stood in his scarred backyard, the broken, jagged slabs of concrete jutting from the thick mud like tombstones for a stillborn idea. The confrontation was inevitable, bubbling up from the collective grief and anger. When Margot arrived, clipboard still clutched in her hand like a shield, and began talking about documenting damages for the insurance claim, the dam of the neighbors' pent-up frustration finally broke. "You mean the same board that caused the flood?" Devon asked, his voice cutting through the chorus of complaints with weary clarity. Eddie and others immediately joined in, their faces etched with the raw betrayal of those who had trusted authority. Margot's weak defense, "We're all victims here," rang utterly hollow in the face of so much preventable destruction. "Victims?" Devon's voice rose, sharp with a pain that was more than just physical exhaustion. "You poured concrete into a live creek. I told you in writing, with maps, with data, exactly what would happen. You ignored every warning, and now you're standing here pretending this was some unavoidable act of God." It was at this moment of peak tension, as the community teetered on the brink of fracturing completely, that Camille Drury entered their lives like a calm in a second storm. An environmental attorney with a sharp mind and an unwavering, calm demeanor, she saw their case not as a simple neighborhood dispute, but as a clear, actionable violation of state and county law. In a packed, tense community meeting at the local library, she laid out the facts with surgical precision, her voice resonating in the hushed, anxious room. "What happened here was not an act of God," she stated, letting the words hang in the air. "It was an act of arrogance, compounded by negligence." She systematically dismantled Margot's faltering defenses, revealing the lack of required permits, the ignored warnings from the county, and the contractor's failure to provide environmental compliance certificates. The room's collective sentiment shifted palpably from confused anger to grim, clear-eyed realization. They were not victims of simple bad luck, but of willfully preventable negligence. Guided by Camille's steady hand, Devon helped organize the overwhelming mountain of evidence, the emails, the photos, the damning paper trail. The ensuing legal battle drew increasing media attention, transforming their local disaster into a national cautionary tale about the limits of control and the power of nature. Devon, reluctant and uncomfortable in the spotlight, nevertheless became the face of the fight. His quiet dignity and simple, powerful statements, "You can't bury a creek and expect it to forget where it used to run," resonating with thousands who saw in his story a reflection of their own battles against unyielding bureaucracy. The county investigation, accelerated by the unwelcome publicity, confirmed every one of Devon's initial warnings in an official, publicly released report. The HOA was found legally liable, and the board members were held personally responsible for the colossal cost of restoration, a sum that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the final explosive HOA meeting, a pale and visibly trembling Margot was met with a unified chorus of anger and was unanimously voted out of power, her reign of order ending in utter chaos. When the excavators finally arrived to tear out the broken, hated concrete, it was a cathartic release for the entire community. A spontaneous cheer went up from the gathered residents as the first trickle of water found its old, forgotten path, glinting in the sunlight like a symbol of hope and resilience. The restoration was a long, slow, and arduous process, but it healed more than just the land. It began to mend the torn social fabric of the neighborhood. One cool autumn afternoon, as Devin worked alone along the newly freed and restored banks, a hesitant voice spoke from behind him. It was Margot, but a transformed version. She was dressed not in her signature pressed khakis, but in faded, muddy jeans and a simple sweatshirt. "Need an extra pair of hands?" she asked, her voice softer, stripped of its former authority. It was not an apology in words, but an offering in action, more powerful than any speech. As they worked side by side in a comfortable silence, clearing the final physical remnants of her catastrophic mistake, a fragile new understanding began to take root between them. The neighborhood that slowly emerged from the disaster was different, visibly scarred but more honest, more resilient, and more united than it had ever been before the concrete had ever been poured. Devin, once the lone voice crying in the wilderness, was now its respected, unofficial elder, a keeper of hard-won wisdom. The new creek, with its reinforced natural banks and native plants, flowed freely once more, its gentle murmur a constant living reminder of the profound lesson they had all learned the hard way. The real victory, Devin often thought as he watched the dragonflies return, was not found in the court settlements or the assigned blame, but in this hard-won wisdom that some things, like a flowing creek, a sense of community, or the enduring force of nature itself, are far too vital to be controlled, and must simply be understood, respected, and cherished.